They found her crawling through the sagebrush at dawn, her wedding dress torn to shreds and her back carved with whip marks that spelled out the word worthless in jagged scars. But the Comanche warrior who discovered her would spend the next 6 months proving that sometimes the most broken souls are exactly what a gentle heart has been waiting for. The morning mist hung low over the Texas plains when Wakiza first spotted the figure moving through the wild grass like a wounded animal seeking shelter. He had been tracking a stolen horse for 3 days, following hoofprints that led toward the white settlement of Cedar Ridge when movement in the draw below caught his trained eye. At first glance, he thought it might be an injured deer, the way it moved in halting, painful steps through the prairie grass. But as he guided his paint horse closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, a white woman, crawling on her hands and knees through the thorny brush, leaving a trail of blood drops on the dry earth behind her. Her dress had once been white, he could tell from the few clean patches that remained, but now it hung in tatters, around her body like the remnants of a burial shroud. Her long auburn hair was matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood, hanging in tangles that obscured her face as she moved with desperate determination toward the rocky outcropping, where Wakiza's band had made their temporary camp. Wakiza dismounted silently, his moccasined feet making no sound on the sun-baked earth. He was known among his people as the one who moved like shadow, the warrior who could track a sparrow through a thunderstorm and hunt deer without disturbing the morning dew. But as he approached the crawling figure, every instinct screamed at him to be careful. White women meant trouble. They meant soldiers and revenge and the kind of violence that left entire villages burning in the night. The woman hadn't noticed him yet. She was focused entirely on moving forward, one bloody hand after another, her breathing coming in short, agonized gasps that spoke of ribs that might be cracked and lungs that fought for every breath. When she finally raised her head to check her direction, Wakiza saw her face clearly for the first time, and the sight hit him like a physical blow to his chest. She was young, perhaps 20 summers, with features that would have been beautiful if they weren't painted with bruises. Her left eye was swollen shut, the flesh around it purple and green, in a way that spoke of violence several days old. Her lips were split and crusted with dried blood, and there was a gash across her forehead that had been bleeding freely but was now starting to scab over. But it was her eyes, the one eye that could still open, that stopped Wakiza cold. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of horses that had been broken too harshly, in the faces of children who had witnessed their parents killed by soldiers. It was the look of something that had been shattered so completely that it no longer believed in the possibility of wholeness. When she saw him standing there, 20 feet away, and watching her with the stillness of a predator deciding whether to strike, she didn't scream. She didn't try to run or beg for mercy. Instead, she simply stopped crawling and lowered herself flat against the earth, pressing her cheek into the dirt as if she could disappear into the ground itself. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that she was clearly trying to suppress, and Wakiza could see fresh blood seeping through the torn fabric of her dress where movement had reopened wounds on her back. "Please," she whispered, her voice so quiet he almost missed it over the sound of wind through the grass. "Please just make it quick." The words were spoken in English, but they carried a weight of defeat that needed no translation. This was a woman who had given up on the possibility of rescue, who expected nothing but more pain from any encounter with another human being. She was asking him to kill her quickly as an act of mercy. Wakiza felt something twist in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a boy watching his younger sister die from the white man's spotted fever. He was a warrior, trained from childhood to show no weakness, to feel no unnecessary compassion for enemies of his people. But this broken creature lying in the dirt wasn't an enemy. She was barely even human anymore. She was just pain-wrapped in torn white fabric, suffering that had taken the shape of a woman. He approached slowly, the way he would approach a wounded animal that might bite from fear rather than malice. When he was close enough to touch her, he crouched down and studied the damage that had been done to her. What he saw made his jaw clench with a rage that surprised him in its intensity. The cuts on her back weren't random wounds from a fight or an accident. They were deliberate, carved with precision and purpose. Someone had taken time to inflict this damage, had planned each cut to maximize pain while avoiding vital organs that might cause quick death. This was torture, pure and methodical. "Who did this to you?" he asked in English, his voice gentle despite the fury building in his chest. He had learned the white man's language from traders and missionaries who had passed through their territory, though he rarely had cause to use it. The woman's body went rigid at the sound of his voice, as if she expected his words to be followed by more violence. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she turned her head just enough to look at him with her one functioning eye, studying his face as if trying to determine what new form of torment he might represent. He saw her take in his appearance, the traditional Comanche braids, the buckskin shirt and leggings, the eagle feather tied in his hair, and something like recognition flickered across her features. "You're going to scalp me," she said matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. There was no fear in her voice, only a kind of weary acceptance that spoke of someone who had already endured worse things than death. "That's what your people do to mine." The words should have stung, should have provoked anger at the casual way she referred to the violence between their peoples. But Wakiza heard only exhaustion in her voice, the tone of someone who was simply stating what she believed to be facts. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said carefully, unsure why he felt the need to offer reassurance to this stranger. "You are injured. You need water and medicine." He gestured toward the camp where smoke from the morning fires was beginning to rise above the rocks. "My people can help you heal." The words felt strange coming from his mouth. Comanche warriors didn't typically offer aid to white settlers, especially not female captives who might bring soldiers down upon them. The woman's eye widened at his words, as if the concept of help was so foreign she couldn't quite process it. "Your people," she repeated slowly. "How many?" The question was practical rather than fearful, as if she was calculating odds rather than planning escape. "Small band," Wakiza replied honestly. 8 warriors, 12 women and children. We are hunting party, not war party." He didn't mention that they were also scouting for signs of soldier movements, or that they had weapons enough to defend themselves if necessary. Something about this woman's broken state made him want to offer truth rather than strategic misdirection. She was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "They'll come looking. For me, my husband and his brothers. They'll want to finish what they started." The words sent a chill down Wakiza's spine, not because of the threat they implied, but because of the flat, emotionless way she delivered them. This woman wasn't warning him. She was simply stating a fact about her own worthlessness. "Your husband did this." The question came out harder than he intended, and he saw her flinch at his tone. He forced his voice back to gentleness, though. Rage was building like a thunderstorm in his chest. "The cuts on your back, your husband made them." She nodded once, a tiny movement that seemed to cost her tremendous effort. "On our wedding night," she whispered. "Said he needed to make sure I understood my place. Said his first wife was too soft, too willful. Said he was going to train me proper from the start." The matter-of-fact way she recounted the horror made Wakiza's hands clench into fists. He had seen the aftermath of many battles, had witnessed the worst that men could do to each other in war. But there was something particularly sickening about deliberate cruelty inflicted in what should have been a place of safety. "You ran away," he observed, and she nodded again. 3 days ago, waited until he passed out drunk, then took his horse and rode as far as I could before it threw me. She gestured weakly at her torn dress and bloodied body. Wasn't far enough, I guess. Nothing ever is. The resignation in her voice was absolute, the tone of someone who had stopped believing in the possibility of escape or rescue. Wakiza found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. You will come with me to my camp. The women will tend your wounds. You will eat and rest and heal. He paused, studying her face for any sign of hope or fear. And if your husband comes looking, he will find that Comanche warriors do not approve of men who carve words into women's flesh. The promise was spoken quietly, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. Allah! For the first time since he had found her, something flickered in the woman's eye that wasn't despair. Not hope exactly, she seemed too broken for that, but perhaps the faintest possibility that the world might contain something other than cruelty. Why? She asked. Why would you help me? I'm nothing, I'm worthless. It's carved right into my skin if you want to read it yourself. The words were delivered with such casual self-hatred that Wakiza felt his heart constrict. What is your name? He asked instead of answering her question directly. She looked surprised, as if no one had asked her that question in a very long time. Faith, she said quietly. Faith Winters. Though I reckon that name don't fit anymore, seeing as how I ain't got faith in much of anything these days. The bitter laugh that followed the words was more painful to hear than her earlier crying had been. Faith, Wakiza repeated, testing the foreign sounds on his tongue. It is a good name, strong name. He stood and extended his hand toward her palm up, an offer rather than a demand. I am called Wakiza. It means desperate fighter in my language. Perhaps we are both well named. There was something in his tone that made her look up at him more carefully, studying his face as if trying to determine whether his words carried hidden mockery. She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, as if it might be a trap or a test. When she finally reached out to take it, her fingers were trembling so badly she could barely maintain contact. Wakiza helped her to her feet with careful gentleness, noting how she favored her left side and the way her breathing hitched. When she tried to straighten fully, whatever had been done to her was extensive, and some of the damage might be permanent. I can't walk far, she admitted, shame coloring her voice as if her injuries were a personal failing. And I can't ride. Every movement feels like it's tearing something open again. Wakiza nodded understanding and whistled softly. His paint horse approached immediately, trained to respond to the subtlest signals. But instead of helping Faith mount, he swung up onto the horse's back himself, then extended his hand down to her. You will ride with me, he said simply. I will make sure you do not fall. The offer was practical and necessary, but Faith stared up at him as if he had offered her something impossible. You do that? Ride double with a white woman? Won't your people think less of you for it? The questions revealed how little she understood about Comanche culture, but they also showed that beneath her despair, she still had enough awareness to consider the social implications of his kindness. My people judge actions, not appearances, Wakiza replied. Helping someone who needs help is always honorable, no matter the color of their skin. It was a simplification of a much more complex cultural reality, but it was also fundamentally true. The Comanche respected strength and courage wherever they found it, and there was a kind of strength in this woman's survival that he was beginning to recognize. With infinite care, he helped Faith up behind him on the horse, feeling how she trembled with pain and exhaustion as she settled against his back. Her arms came around his waist tentatively, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to hold on for support. Through the torn fabric of her dress, he could feel the raised welts and cuts that covered her back, evidence of systematic torture that made his anger burn hotter with each breath. As they rode toward camp, Faith was silent except for occasional soft gasps when the horse's movement jarred her injuries. But Wakiza could feel the way she gradually relaxed against him, her body finally allowing itself to acknowledge how exhausted and hurt she really was. For the first time in 3 days, she was safe enough to stop fighting, safe enough to let her guard down just slightly. The camp came into view as they crested a small rise, and Wakiza felt Faith tense behind him as she saw the cluster of teepees and the people moving about their morning activities. "They're all going to stare," she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "They're going to wonder why you brought home a broken white woman instead of just leaving her to die like she deserves." The casual way she spoke about her own worthlessness made Wakiza's chest ache. "They will stare because you are hurt and need help," he corrected gently. "And because my grandmother will want to scold me for not bringing you straight to her lodge so she can tend your wounds properly." It was true. Ayana, his grandmother, and the band's most skilled healer had strong opinions about the proper treatment of injured people, regardless of their origins. As they entered the camp, conversations stopped and heads turned, but not with the hostility Faith had expected. Instead, Wakiza saw recognition in the faces of his people, the recognition of someone who had survived something terrible and was now under the protection of one of their warriors. Several of the women approached immediately, their expressions serious but not unkind. Ayana emerged from her lodge as soon as she heard the commotion, her weathered face creasing with concern as she took in Faith's condition. She spoke rapidly to Wakiza in Comanche, her tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in matters of healing. Wakiza dismounted first, then helped Faith down with the same careful gentleness he had shown throughout their journey. "My grandmother says you will stay in her lodge while you heal," he translated for Faith. "She also says that whoever did this to you has no honor, and that you are safe here until you are strong enough to decide what you want to do next." Ayana nodded approvingly at his translation, then gestured for Faith to follow her toward the largest teepee in the camp. Faith looked back at Wakiza as Ayana began leading her away, her one good eye wide with something that might have been gratitude or disbelief. "Why?" she asked again, the same question she had posed in the grass. "Why are you helping me when you don't even know me?" It was clear that kindness from strangers was not something she had experienced much of in her life. Wakiza met her gaze steadily, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Because you crawled through thorns and across miles of prairie to get away from someone who hurt you. Because you never stopped fighting, even when you wanted to die. Because that kind of strength deserves respect no matter who carries it." The words seemed to hit Faith like a physical blow, and fresh tears began sliding down her bruised cheeks. "I'm not strong," she whispered. "I'm broken and used and worthless. It's written right there on my back for everyone to see." But even as she spoke the words, there was a tiny crack in her absolute certainty, a hairline fracture in the wall of self-hatred that had been built up around her heart. "Scars are not shame," Wakiza said quietly. "They are proof that you survived something that was meant to destroy you. That is the opposite of worthless. That is precious." The words hung in the air between them like a promise, and for just a moment, Faith looked at him as if he might be telling her something true about herself that she had never considered before. The interior of Ayana's lodge was unlike anything Faith had ever seen, warm and spacious, with buffalo hide walls that filtered the morning sunlight into a golden glow. Bundles of herbs hung from the support poles, filling the air with the scent of sage and sweetgrass, while clay pots of various sizes lined the walls, each containing different medicines and healing salves. A small fire burned in the center of the space, its smoke rising through an opening in the roof, and around the fire were arranged comfortable sleeping robes and backrests made of willow branches. Ayana moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades tending to the wounded and sick, her hands sure and gentle as she guided Faith to a soft buffalo robe near the fire. The old woman's face was deeply lined with age, but her dark eyes were sharp and kind, missing nothing as she assessed Faith's condition with the practiced gaze of a master healer. She spoke softly in Comanche to two younger women who had followed them into the lodge, and they immediately began gathering supplies. She says you must remove the dress so she can see the full extent of your injuries, one of the younger women translated in hesitant English. Her name was Nayeli, and she was perhaps 18 years old, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded Faith of her younger sister back in Missouri. She also says that whatever was done to you was done by a coward who knew how to cause pain without causing death, and that such men are the lowest form of life. The translation carried an edge of anger that suggested Nayeli had added her own editorial comment to Ayana's words. Faith's hands shook as she reached for the ties of her torn wedding dress, the simple act of undressing suddenly seeming monumental. The dress had been her mother's, altered to fit Faith's smaller frame, and wearing it on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life had felt like carrying her mother's blessing into her new marriage. Now it was ruined, stained with blood and dirt and torn beyond repair, a symbol of how thoroughly her dreams had been destroyed. When the dress finally fell away, the full extent of the damage was revealed, and Faith heard Nayeli's sharp intake of breath. The word worthless had been carved into the skin of her upper back with deliberate precision, the letters deep enough to scar permanently, but not deep enough to threaten vital organs. Below that, dozens of smaller cuts created a pattern of deliberate cruelty, each one placed to maximize pain while avoiding serious injury. Her ribs showed dark bruises where kicks had landed, and her arms bore the marks of ropes that had been used to restrain her. Ayana's expression darkened as she examined the wounds, her weathered hands hovering over the damaged skin without. In quite touching, she spoke rapidly in Comanche, her voice carrying a tone of disgust and anger that needed no translation. When she was finished, she looked directly into Faith's eyes and spoke a few words in English, carefully pronounced despite her accent. "Not worthless," Ayana said firmly, pointing at the carved word on Faith's back. "Precious, sacred, strong woman who survived." She then switched back to Comanche, speaking to Nayeli, who nodded and began translating. "My grandmother says that the man who did this to you has marked you with lies. She says that in our tradition, scars tell the story of a person's battles, and your scars tell the story of someone who was tortured but refused to break. She says that makes you a warrior, whether you know it or not." The words were spoken with such conviction that Faith felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny crack in the wall of self-hatred she had built around her heart. The healing process was unlike anything Faith had experienced. Ayana worked with careful patience, cleaning each wound with warm water infused with healing herbs, her touch so gentle that Faith barely felt pain, despite the severity of her injuries. The old woman hummed softly as she worked, a melody that seemed to vibrate through Faith's bones and ease tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. "The humming is a healing song," Nayeli explained quietly as she helped hold supplies for her grandmother. "She learned it from her own grandmother, who learned it from hers. It's very old magic, meant to help the body remember how to be whole again." Faith had never put much stock in what her people would call heathen magic, but she couldn't deny that the humming seemed to make the pain more bearable, as if the melody itself had the power to soothe more than just her physical wounds. As Ayana worked, other women from the band began arriving at the lodge, each bringing small gifts, a bowl of soup, a soft blanket, a comb carved from bone. They didn't speak to Faith directly, understanding that she was still too fragile for conversation, but their presence was a quiet message of acceptance and protection. These women had all heard the story of how Wakiza had found her, and they had all seen the evidence of what had been done to her. In their culture, such cruelty toward a woman was not just wrong, it was an abomination that demanded response. One woman, introduced as Itzel, brought a dress made of soft doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork in shades of blue and silver. She held it up against Faith's shoulders, checking the fit, then nodded approvingly and set it aside for when Faith was ready to wear it. The gesture was simple but profound. These women were already thinking of Faith as someone who would recover, someone who would need proper clothing for her new life, whatever that might look like. She made that dress for her daughter who died of the white man's spotted fever 3 winters ago. Nayeli translated softly. She says it has been waiting for the right person to wear it, and she believes that person is you. Faith felt tears sliding down her cheeks at the generosity of the gesture, the way these strangers were offering her not just healing, but belonging. As the day wore on, Faith drifted in and out of sleep, her body finally allowing itself to rest now that she was safe and cared for. In her dreams, she was back in the cabin with her husband Edmund, feeling the bite of the whip across her back and hearing his voice explaining that this was what wives deserved when they didn't show. Proper gratitude for their husband's guidance, but each time the nightmare began to take hold, she would hear Ayana's humming or feel the gentle touch of healing hands, and the dream would fade back into darkness. When she woke fully, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lodge floor. Ayana was still there, grinding herbs with a stone pestle, preparing new medicines for the evening treatment. Faith tried to sit up and was surprised to find that the movement didn't cause the sharp, stabbing pain she had grown accustomed to. The herbal treatments were working faster than she had thought possible. "How long have I been sleeping?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. Nayeli looked up from the beadwork she had been stitching by the firelight. "Most of the day. Grandmother says that healing sleep is different from regular sleep. It does more work in less time." She set aside her beadwork and moved closer to Faith. "How do you feel? Are you strong enough for some soup?" The question was asked with the careful attention of someone who understood that recovery was measured in small steps. Faith considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her body's condition. The sharp, constant pain that had been her companion for 3 days had dulled to a manageable ache, and her breathing came easier now that the herbs had reduced the swelling around her ribs. More importantly, the crushing sense of despair that had been weighing on her spirit seemed lighter somehow, as if the kindness of these women had begun to lift a burden she hadn't even realized she was carrying. "I think I could manage some soup," she said carefully, not wanting to overestimate her strength, but genuinely feeling hungry for the first time since her wedding night. Nayeli smiled and ladled soup from a pot that had been simmering over the fire, the rich scent of meat and vegetables making Faith's stomach clench with sudden appetite. As Faith sipped the soup slowly, savoring the warmth and nourishment, she found herself studying the women who had taken her in. They moved with easy confidence around the lodge, tending the fire, preparing medicines, and working on various crafts with the practiced efficiency of people who had found their place in the world. There was a harmony to their interactions that Faith had never seen among the white women she knew, a sense of mutual respect and shared purpose that seemed to eliminate the petty jealousies and competitions that had characterized her experience of female relationships. "Can I ask you something?" Faith said hesitantly, addressing Nayeli but glancing toward Ayana as well. "Why are you helping me? I mean, I know Wakiza brought me here, but you don't have to be kind to me. I'm a stranger, and my people haven't exactly been friendly to yours." The question had been gnawing at her all day. This level of care and acceptance seemed too good to be true, and Faith's experience had taught her to be suspicious of unexpected kindness. Nayeli translated the question for Ayana, and the old woman's response was immediate and firm. She says that suffering recognizes suffering, and that healing is a gift that grows stronger when it's shared. She also says that the fact that you're white doesn't matter. What matters is that you're a woman who was hurt by a man who should have protected you, and that's something that happens to women of all colors. Nayeli paused, then added her own thoughts. My grandmother lost 2 daughters to white soldiers who attacked our camp when I was little. But she says hatred is a poison that hurts the person carrying it more than the person it's aimed at. She chooses to heal instead of hate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The simple wisdom of the statement hit Faith like a physical blow. She had spent so much energy hating herself, believing the terrible things Edmund had told her about her own worthlessness, that she hadn't considered the possibility of choosing a different response to her pain. The idea that healing could be a choice rather than something that just happened or didn't happen was revolutionary. I don't know how to heal, Faith admitted quietly. I don't even know how to stop hearing his voice in my head, telling me all the ways I'm broken and useless. The confession came out in a rush, as if saying the words quickly might make them less shameful. Every time I start to feel even a little bit better, I remember what he said about training me, about making sure I knew my place. And I feel like maybe he was right. Maybe I did deserve what happened. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but they also felt like a relief to finally speak aloud. Ayana's expression softened with understanding, and she reached out to take Faith's hand in both of hers. Her skin was weathered and calloused from decades of work, but her touch was infinitely gentle as she spoke in careful English. Bad man's words are like poison arrows. They go deep, hurt long time after arrow is gone. But poison can be drawn. Out wound can be cleaned, new skin can grow. She squeezed Faith's hand gently. Takes time, takes patience, but you are stronger than poison. You are here, you are alive, you are healing. That proves strength. The conversation was interrupted by a soft rustling at the lodge entrance, and Wakiza ducked through the flap, carrying an armload of firewood. He moved quietly, clearly trying not to disturb Faith if she was sleeping, and seemed surprised to find her awake and alert. In the firelight, Faith could see him more clearly than she had during their morning encounter, and she was struck by the combination of strength and gentleness in his features. He was tall and lean, with the kind of muscular build that came from a lifetime of physical activity rather than deliberate training. His hair was black as midnight, braided with small feathers and beads that caught the firelight when he moved. But it was his eyes that captured Faith's attention, dark brown and intelligent, with a depth of compassion that seemed at odds with everything she had been taught about savage Indians. When he looked at her, she didn't see the predatory hunger that had been constant in Edmund's gaze. Instead, she saw genuine concern and something that might have been respect. "How are you feeling?" he asked in English, setting the firewood near the fire pit with careful quiet. "Grandmother has been working her healing magic on you all day." There was warmth in his voice when he spoke of Ayana, the kind of affection that spoke of deep familial bonds and mutual respect. "Better," Faith said honestly, surprised to realize it was true. "Much better than I expected to feel." She paused, studying his face in the firelight. "Thank you for bringing me here, for convincing your people to help me. I know it can't have been an easy decision." She was acutely aware that she was speaking to a man while wearing only a soft blanket draped over her shoulders, but somehow his presence didn't feel threatening or inappropriate. Wakiza shook his head dismissively. Easy decision. Right decision. Any decent person would have done the same. He settled onto a buffalo robe across the fire from her, far enough away to maintain propriety, but close enough for conversation. The hard decision will be what you want to do when you're healed. My grandmother says your wounds will mend well, but you will need to decide what kind of life you want to build for yourself. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Faith wasn't ready to consider. For 3 days, her only goal had been survival, getting through each hour, each mile, each breath without giving up entirely. The idea that she might have choices about her future, that she might be able to build something new rather than just endure whatever was left of what had been destroyed, was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I've never had to make that kind of decision before. My father chose my husband. My husband chose everything else. I don't even know what I would want if I could have anything." The admission felt shameful. What kind of grown woman didn't know? Her own mind. But it was also liberating to speak the truth about how little control she had ever had over her own life. "Then you have time to learn," Wakiza said simply. "No one will force you to decide anything while you're healing. When you're strong again, when your body and spirit have had time to recover, then you can think about what kind of future you want." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "But I will tell you this. Whatever you decide, you will not be going back to the man who carved lies into your skin. That I promise you." The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent a shiver through Faith that had nothing to do with cold or fear. She had never had someone speak about protecting her with such conviction, such absolute certainty. Edmund had claimed to be her protector, but his protection had come with conditions and punishments and the constant threat of violence if she didn't show proper gratitude. Wakiza's promise felt different, unconditional, and given freely with no expectation of anything in return. "He'll come looking for me," Faith said quietly. "Edmund doesn't like to lose things that belong to him, and in his mind, I belong to him until I'm dead." The thought of her husband tracking her to this peaceful camp filled her with cold dread. These people had been nothing but kind to her, and the idea that their kindness might bring violence down upon them was almost unbearable. "Let him come," Wakiza said, and there was steel beneath the quiet words. "He will find that Comanche warriors have strong opinions about men who torture women. He will also find that you are under our protection now, and we do not give up those we have promised to defend." The matter-of-fact way he spoke about facing down armed white men sent another shiver through Faith, though this one might have been anticipation rather than dread. As the evening wore on, the lodge filled with the quiet sounds of domestic life. The crackling of the fire, the soft murmur of women's voices, the rhythmic sound of Ayana grinding herbs for the next day's treatments. Faith found herself relaxing into the peaceful atmosphere, her body finally beginning to believe that she was truly safe. For the first time in days, she wasn't constantly listening for footsteps or flinching at sudden movements. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive during her escape was slowly giving way to something that might eventually become peace. When Nayeli brought her a sleeping robe and helped her settle down for the night, Faith was surprised to find that she was actually looking forward to sleep rather than dreading the nightmares that might come. The combination of healing herbs, physical exhaustion, and emotional safety was more powerful than any medicine she had ever taken. "Will you be all right?" Nayeli asked softly, tucking the robe around Faith's shoulders with maternal care. "If you have bad dreams or need anything during the night, just call out. Someone will always be here to help you." The simple assurance that she wouldn't be alone with her fears was almost enough to bring tears to Faith's eyes. "Thank you," Faith whispered, meaning more than just the offer of nighttime comfort. "Thank you all for giving me a chance to heal. I never expected to find such kindness, especially not from people I was taught to fear." The words were inadequate to express the depth of her gratitude, but they were all she had. As Faith drifted off to sleep, she could hear Ayana humming softly by the fire, the ancient melody weaving through her consciousness like a lullaby. For the first time since her wedding night, she fell asleep without fear, surrounded by the sounds and scents of safety. And in her dreams, instead of Edmund's voice telling her she was worthless, she heard Ayana's firm English words, "Not worthless. Precious, sacred, strong woman who survived." 3 days after Wakiza had found Faith crawling through the prairie grass, the first signs of trouble arrived with the dawn. Young Chaitin, barely 16 and eager to prove himself as a scout, came thundering into camp on a lathered horse, his face tight with urgency as he sought out the war chief. Faith was sitting outside Ayana's lodge, wearing the beautiful doe-skin dress Itzel had given her and carefully braiding sweetgrass under Nayeli's patient instruction when the commotion began. She looked up to see Chaitin dismounting in a rush, speaking rapidly in Comanche to the gathered warriors. Though she couldn't understand the words, the tension in his voice and the immediate change in the camp's atmosphere told her everything she needed to know. Her past had found her. Edmund was coming, and he wasn't coming alone. Wakiza appeared at her side so quickly she hadn't seen him approach, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as he crouched down beside her. His face was calm, but she could see the warrior's alertness. In his eyes, the way he positioned himself between her and the direction Chaitin had come from. "How many?" he asked quietly, and Faith realized he already knew what the scout had reported. 8 men, Faith whispered, her hands shaking as she set down the half-braided sweetgrass. Edmund and his 3 brothers, plus 4 hands from their ranch. They're all armed, and they're all mean as rattlesnakes when they're riled. She could picture them in her mind, big, brutal men who solved problems with violence and considered themselves above the law in their corner of Texas. "Wakiza, you have to let me go. If I'm not here when they arrive, maybe they'll turn around and leave your people alone." Even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. Men like Edmund didn't give up easily, especially when their pride had been wounded. "You are not going anywhere," Wakiza said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "You are under our protection now, and we do not abandon those we have promised to defend." He stood and called out something in Comanche, and immediately the camp began to transform. Women and children moved with practiced efficiency toward the center of the circle, while warriors began checking weapons and preparing defensive positions. Faith watched in amazement as the peaceful morning camp became a fortress. In a matter of minutes, these people had clearly faced threats before and knew exactly how to respond. But what struck her most was that no one seemed to blame her for bringing danger to their door. Instead, they moved with the calm determination of people protecting one of their own. "This is my fault," Faith said, standing unsteadily as the weight of guilt crashed over her. "All of this is happening because of me. Your people could be hurt or killed because I was too weak to stay and accept what my husband wanted to do to me." The self-recrimination came pouring out before she could stop it. Years of Edmund's conditioning, making her automatically take responsibility for any conflict or violence. Ayana appeared beside her granddaughter, her weathered face stern as she listened to Faith's words. She spoke sharply in Comanche, then switched to her careful English. "Not your fault. Bad man's fault. You did not choose to be hurt. You chose to survive. Big difference." The old woman's dark eyes flashed with anger, but Faith could tell it wasn't directed at her. Men who hurt women are cowards. Cowards who come with many guns are still cowards, just dangerous cowards. The sound of approaching horses could be heard in the distance now, a rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Faith's heart began racing as memories of Edmund's rage flooded back. the way his face had looked. When he realized she had taken his horse, the promises of punishment he had shouted after her as she fled into the darkness. He would be beyond furious now, and fury made him capable of unspeakable cruelty. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats. "Oh God, they're actually here." Despite Wakiza's promises and the warriors' preparations, Faith felt terror clawing at her chest. She had seen what Edmund was capable of when he was angry, and she knew that his humiliation at losing his bride would only fuel his desire for revenge. Wakiza moved to stand directly in front of her, his body serving as a shield between Faith and the approaching danger. He had changed since Chaitan's arrival, she realized. The gentle man who had cared for her wounds and spoken softly about healing had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous, a warrior ready to fight for what he believed in. The transformation was both reassuring and terrifying. The riders came into view cresting the ridge above the camp, 8 men silhouetted against the morning sky like harbingers of violence. Even at a distance, Faith could pick out Edmund's bulky form on his black stallion, the same horse she had stolen for her escape. He sat his mount with the arrogant confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, surveying the Comanche camp below as if he were looking at property he intended to claim. "Edmund Garrett," Faith whispered, and Wakiza nodded, grimly. Even without knowing the man's name, it was obvious which rider was her husband. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to command, the sort of man who expected others to step aside when he approached. But there was also something in his posture that spoke of barely controlled rage, the kind of anger that made men do things they would later regret. The riders began their descent toward the camp, moving at a steady pace that suggested they were confident in their superiority. 8 armed white men against a small band of Comanche. In their minds, the outcome was already decided. They had no way of knowing that these particular Comanche had survived years of conflict with the U.S. Army and were not easily intimidated by superior numbers. As the riders drew closer, Faith could make out individual faces, and what she saw made her blood run cold. These weren't just angry men coming to retrieve stolen property. These were men who had worked themselves into a killing fury during their 3-day pursuit. Edmund's face was flushed red with rage, and his brothers wore expressions of anticipation that suggested they were looking forward to the violence to come. "Faith Garrett," Edmund's voice boomed across the camp as the riders pulled up just outside the circle of lodges. "Get yourself out here right now, woman. You've caused enough trouble with your foolishness." His tone carried the authority of someone who had never been disobeyed, the casual arrogance of a man who considered his wife to be property rather than a person. Faith felt her body beginning to shake with involuntary terror, years of conditioning, making her want to obey despite everything that had happened. But before she could move, Wakiza stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the mounted men and the camp. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the space between them, calm and steady despite the odds he faced. "The woman you seek is under our protection. She came to us injured and asking for help, and we have given it freely. You are not welcome here." The words were spoken in perfect English, with none of the broken grammar Edmund would have expected from a savage. Wakiza's calm dignity clearly caught the white men off guard. Edmund's face darkened further at being addressed as an equal by an Indian. "That woman is my wife, legally married before God and witnesses. She belongs to me, and I'm taking her home where she can learn some proper respect for her husband's authority." He gestured toward his men. "Now, step aside before someone gets hurt unnecessarily." "The only unnecessary hurt here was what you did to her before she fled," Wakiza replied, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made several of the horses shift nervously. We have seen the word you carved into her back. We know what kind of husband you are." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Faith saw Edmund's hand move instinctively toward his gun. "What I do to discipline my own wife is none of your concern, savage," Edmund snarled, his facade of civilized authority beginning to crack. "That woman ran off with my horse and my property, and I mean to have satisfaction for the theft. Now bring her out here, or we'll come in after her." The threat was delivered with the confidence of men who had never faced serious resistance. From the native tribes they considered inferior, but as Edmund spoke, Faith noticed something that clearly hadn't registered with him. More Comanche warriors had appeared around the edges of the camp, emerging from concealment with the silent efficiency of men who knew their business. What had started as 8 armed whites against a handful of visible defenders had become something much more even. The Comanche had been preparing for this confrontation while Edmund had been making threats. "You speak of theft," called out another voice, and Faith turned to see an older Comanche man stepping forward. This had to be Tahitan, the war chief Wakiza had mentioned, a man whose reputation for tactical brilliance was known even among the white settlements. But what do you call taking a woman against her will? What do you call marking her with knives? For your pleasure? In our law, that is not marriage, that is slavery. Edmund's face went purple with rage at being lectured by an Indian about marriage law. "Your law doesn't apply to Christian white folks, Chief. That woman is mine by right of marriage, and I'll not be told different by a pack of heathens." He raised his voice, clearly intending for Faith to hear every word. "Faith, you get yourself out here this instant. Every minute you delay means worse punishment when I get you home. You know I always keep my promises about consequences." The words hit Faith like physical blows, each threat bringing back memories of previous punishments, previous lessons in obedience that had been carved into her flesh and beaten into her bones. She felt herself beginning to hyperventilate, the old patterns of fear and submission trying to reassert themselves, despite everything she had learned about her own worth during her time with the Comanche. But then Ayana's hand closed around hers, warm and steady and real. "Breathe, child," the old woman said quietly. "His words have no power here. You are not his property. You are a free woman under our protection." The simple reminder helped Faith find her center again, helped her remember that she had choices, now that she hadn't had before. "I'm not going back," Faith called out, her voice shaking but audible across the camp. It was the first time she had ever directly defied Edmund, and the words felt both terrifying and liberating. "I'm not your property, and I'm not going to let you hurt me anymore." The declaration seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed, and Faith could see Edmund's face contorting with fury at her public rebellion. "You little whore," Edmund roared, his voice cracking with rage. "You think these savages are going to protect you from your lawful husband? You think running to a pack of godless heathens is going to save you from learning your proper place?" He turned his attention back to the Comanche warriors. "I'm done talking. Boys, let's go collect what's mine." The white men began to dismount, their movements aggressive and purposeful as they prepared to force their way into the camp. But as they swung down from their horses, they found themselves facing twice as many Comanche warriors as they had initially seen, men who had appeared as if from nowhere to form a defensive line around the lodges. The odds had shifted dramatically while Edmund had been making speeches. "Last chance," Tahitan called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had led warriors into battle many times before. "Leave now, and no blood will be spilled. Continue this course, and you will discover why the Comanche have never been conquered by force." It wasn't a boast. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what his men were capable of. Edmund looked around at the warriors facing him, and for the first time, Faith saw uncertainty flicker across his features. He had expected to intimidate a small band of Indians into surrendering his wife without a fight. Instead, he found himself facing experienced warriors who showed no sign of backing down. But his rage and humiliation were stronger than his tactical sense. "We didn't ride 3 days to turn back empty-handed," he snarled, drawing his gun with a flourish intended to demonstrate his resolve. "That woman belongs to me, and I'm taking her home one way or another." His brothers followed his lead, weapons appearing in their hands as they prepared for the fight their arrogance had made inevitable. The moment Edmund's gun cleared leather, the careful tension that had been building finally snapped. Wakiza moved with fluid grace, his own weapon appearing in his hand as if by magic, while he simultaneously pushed Faith behind him toward the safety of the lodges. Around the camp, other warriors flowed into defensive positions with the coordinated precision of men who had trained together for years. "Get down!" Wakiza commanded Faith, his voice sharp with urgency as the first shot rang out across the camp. She dropped to the ground behind a water barrel, her heart hammering as the sounds of battle erupted around her. This was her fault, she thought desperately. All of this violence, all of this danger was happening because she had been too weak to accept her place as Edmund's wife. But even as the thought formed, she heard Ayana's voice in her memory. "Not your fault. Bad. Man's fault." The old woman was right, Faith realized with sudden clarity. She hadn't started this fight. Edmund had the moment he decided that love meant ownership and that marriage gave him the right to torture another human being. She was not responsible for his choices, only for her own. The battle was swift and decisive, lasting only minutes before the superior tactics and local knowledge of the Comanche warriors told. When the gunfire finally stopped, 4 of Edmund's men lay dead on the ground, while Edmund himself had taken a bullet through the shoulder that left him writhing in the dirt and cursing everything from Indians to women to the God he claimed to serve. His surviving brothers knelt with their hands raised, finally understanding that they had badly misjudged both their opponents and their own chances of success. Wakiza appeared at Faith's side, his face grim but uninjured as he helped her to her feet. "It's over," he said quietly. "Your husband will not be troubling you again." There was something final in his tone, a sense of closure that suggested this confrontation had settled more than just the immediate question of Faith's freedom. Faith looked across the camp to where Edmund lay bleeding and defeated, and felt something unexpected wash over her. Not joy exactly, and certainly not satisfaction in his pain, but a profound sense of relief that seemed to lift a weight she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. The man who had defined her entire sense of self-worth through cruelty and degradation was no longer a threat. She was truly free. "What happens to them now?" she asked, gesturing toward the surviving attackers. Part of her expected Wakiza to say they would be killed outright. It was what Edmund would have done to defeated enemies. But she was beginning to understand that the Comanche operated by different rules than the brutal frontier justice she had grown up with. "They will be given horses and supplies and told to leave this territory," Tahitian answered, having approached during their conversation. "If they are wise, they will never return. If they are foolish enough to come back seeking revenge, they will not leave alive a second time." He looked directly at Faith. "You are free to make your own choices now, woman. What would you have us do with the man who called himself your husband?" Faith looked down at Edmund, who was still conscious despite his wound, and glaring at her with undiminished hatred. Even defeated and bleeding, he was trying to intimidate her with his eyes, to make her feel small and worthless through the sheer force of his disapproval. But the spell was broken now. She could see him clearly for what he was, and what she saw was not a powerful man deserving of fear and obedience, but a pathetic bully who had never learned that strength meant protection, not domination. Let him go, she said finally, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Let him live with the knowledge that he lost everything because he didn't know how to love without hurting. That seems like justice enough. The words felt strange in her mouth. She had never imagined herself as someone who could show mercy to the man who had tortured her. But apparently freedom had room for forgiveness as well as strength. As the defeated men were loaded onto their horses and escorted to the edge of Comanche territory, Faith felt the last chains of her old life falling away. She was no longer Edmund Garrett's wife, no longer a piece of property to be used and discarded at will. She was Faith Winters, again, a woman with choices and a future that she could shape with her own hands. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. "What will you do now?" Wakiza asked, as they watched the dust cloud of the departing riders fade into the distance. "You are free to go wherever you choose, to build whatever life you want. And for yourself." There was something careful in his tone, as if he was trying very hard not to influence her decision one way or another. Faith turned to look at him, this man who had shown her what gentleness looked like, who had proven that strength and kindness could exist in the same person. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. She thought about the question he was really asking, the possibility that hung unspoken between them like a promise waiting to be claimed. For the first time in her life, she was free to choose love instead of having it chosen for her. "I think," she said slowly, a smile beginning to spread across her face, "I'd like to learn more about what it means to be truly free. And I can't think of anyone I'd rather learn from than the people who taught me that scars tell the story of survival, not shame." The words were an answer to more than just his question, and from the way Wakiza's eyes lit up, she could tell he understood exactly what she was choosing. In the weeks that followed Edmund's defeat, Faith discovered that freedom was not a destination but a daily practice, each choice a small act of rebellion against the voice in her head that still whispered she was worthless. The camp had settled back into its peaceful rhythm, but Faith found herself restless in a way she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, her days were not dictated by someone else's expectations or demands, and the vast expanse of possibility before her was both thrilling and terrifying. Wakiza had begun teaching her to ride in the Comanche way, without saddle or bridle, using only a woven rope halter and the subtle communication between horse and rider that his people had perfected over generations. The first lesson had been humbling. Faith, who had considered herself a competent rider on her father's farm, found herself clinging desperately to the horse's mane as it responded to pressures and signals she didn't understand. "You're fighting." The horse, instead of speaking with her, Wakiza observed from where he sat easily on his own mount, watching Faith struggle to maintain her seat on the gentle mare Ayana had selected for her training. "In your world, you control horses with metal bits and leather straps. In ours, we become partners with them." His voice carried the patience of someone who had taught many young warriors this same lesson, but Faith could hear something else. And there too, a gentleness reserved specifically for her. "I don't know how to be a partner," Faith admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment as the mare sidestepped nervously beneath her. "I only know how to obey or to fight. I never learned anything in between." The confession revealed more than just her difficulties with horsemanship. It laid bare the fundamental challenge she faced in rebuilding her entire understanding of relationships. Wakiza dismounted smoothly and approached her horse, his movements calm and deliberate as he placed one hand on the mare's neck and the other on Faith's leg. "Then we will learn together," he said quietly. Partnership is not something that comes naturally to those who have only known submission or domination, but it can be learned like any other skill. His touch was warm through the buckskin of her leggings, steady and reassuring without being possessive. Under his patient guidance, Faith began to understand the subtle language of pressure and release, the way a shift in weight or breathing could communicate intention to an animal that had been bred for thousands of years to work in harmony with humans. It was a revelation that extended far beyond horsemanship. She was learning that cooperation could exist without coercion, that strength could be shared rather than imposed. As her riding skills improved, Wakiza began taking her on longer journeys away from camp, teaching her to read the landscape the way his people did. Every rock formation, every change in vegetation, every shift in the wind carried information about weather, game, and potential dangers. Faith found herself fascinated by this deeper understanding of the natural world, so different from the European approach of imposing order upon nature rather than learning to live within its patterns. "Your people see the land as something to be conquered," Wakiza observed one afternoon as they paused to rest beside a hidden spring deep in the hills. "Mine see it as a teacher to be listened to. Both approaches have their strengths, but only one leads to lasting harmony." He gestured toward the spring, which emerged from between two granite boulders and formed a small pool before disappearing underground again. "This water has been flowing here since before my grandfather's grandfather was born. It will flow here long after we are gone. We can learn from its persistence, its patience, its ability to find a way around obstacles rather than trying to force through them." Faith knelt beside the spring and cupped the cold, clear water in her hands, studying her reflection in the surface. The face that looked back at her was different from the one she remembered from her wedding day. Thinner, marked by recent hardships, but also somehow stronger. Her left eye had healed completely, and the cuts on her face had faded to thin silver. Lines that Ayana said would disappear entirely with time, but it was the expression in her eyes that had changed most dramatically. Where once there had been only fear and submission, now there was something that might have been hope. "I want to learn," she said quietly, meeting Wakiza's gaze across the small pool. "Not just about riding or tracking or any of the practical things. I want to learn how to be the kind of person who chooses partnership over power. How to be someone worthy of the kindness your people have shown me." The words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for weeks and could no longer contain them. Something shifted in Wakiza's expression at her words, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed others to see. "You already are that person," he said softly. "You have been since the moment you chose to crawl through thorns and prairie grass rather than accept a life of cruelty. The learning is not about becoming someone different. It is about discovering who you truly are when you're not afraid." His words hit her like a physical blow, not painful but overwhelming in their kindness. "I don't know who that is yet," Faith admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "For so long, I defined myself by other people's opinions, first my father's, then Edmund's. I don't know what I think about anything, what I want, what I believe. Sometimes I feel like I'm just an empty shell pretending to be a person." The confession was more honest than anything she had ever said aloud, and speaking, it felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown space. Wakiza was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the same careful attention he gave to tracking signs. In the wilderness, when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Then we will discover her together, this woman you are becoming. We will give her time and space and safety to grow, and we will celebrate each small revelation as the precious gift it is." He paused, seeming to wrestle with his own vulnerability. "If you will allow me the honor of sharing that journey with you." The question hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or ignore, and Faith felt her heart begin to race as she understood what he was truly asking. This was not Edmund's brutal demand for submission disguised as love, nor her father's arrangement of her life for his own convenience. This was an invitation freely given, with no pressure and no consequences for refusal, the first genuine choice about partnership she had ever been offered. "I would like that," she said carefully, testing the words for any trace of the fear or obligation that had colored every relationship in her previous life. But all she found was a warm anticipation, a genuine desire to explore what might be possible between two people who chose to walk forward together rather than one following the other. "I would like that very much." The smile that spread across Wakiza's face was like sunrise after a long, cold night, gradual, warm, and transformative. "Then we will take it slowly," he said. "We will learn each other as we learn ourselves, with patience and respect and no expectations beyond what we freely offer." He reached across the space between them and took her hand in his, not grasping or claiming, but simply connecting. "And if you ever feel afraid or pressured or unsure, you need only say so, and we will stop and talk until you feel safe again." The promise meant more to Faith than any declaration of love could have. Edmund had claimed to love her while he carved words into her skin, had spoken of devotion while he broke her ribs with his fists. But Wakiza was offering something Edmund had never understood, not love as possession, but love as liberation. The difference was profound enough to make her dizzy. As they rode back toward camp that evening, Faith found herself studying Wakiza with new eyes, noticing details she had been too traumatized to see before. The way he sat his horse with unconscious grace, moving as if he and the animal shared the same heartbeat. The careful attention he paid to their surroundings, constantly aware of potential dangers without seeming anxious or paranoid. The quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he believed in. "Can I ask you something?" Faith said as they crested the ridge above their camp, the familiar sight of smoke from the evening fires rising into the darkening sky. "Why me? You could have any woman in your band, or any of a dozen other bands, women who understand your culture, who know how to be proper Comanche wives. Why choose someone broken and foreign like me?" Wakiza brought his horse to a stop and turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the fading light. "Because you are not broken," he said firmly. "Wounded, yes, scarred, certainly, but not broken. A broken woman would have accepted what Edmund did to her and found ways to blame herself for deserving it. You fought back, you escaped, you survived." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "And because when I look at you, I see someone who has been through fire and emerged with her essential goodness intact. That is not weakness, that is a kind of strength that cannot be taught or learned. It simply is." The words penetrated deeper than Faith's conscious mind, settling into places that had been empty and aching for longer than she could remember. No one had ever seen strength in her before, only weakness to be corrected, defiance to be punished, or usefulness to be exploited. The idea that her survival itself might be evidence of courage rather than cowardice was revolutionary. When they reached camp, Faith was surprised to find unusual activity around the central fire. The women were dressed in their finest clothing, and the men had painted their faces with symbols she didn't recognize. Children ran between the lodges carrying bundles of sage and sweetgrass, while the elders sat in a formal circle discussing something in low, serious voices. "What's happening?" Faith asked Nayeli, who appeared at her elbow as soon as she dismounted. The young woman's face was bright with excitement, and she wore a dress of white doe skin, decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the firelight like stars. "A celebration," Nayeli said, unable to suppress her smile. "To mark your victory over the men who came to hurt you, and to welcome you officially as a member of our band. Grandmother says it is time for you to choose a new name, one that reflects who you are becoming rather than who you were forced to be." The idea of choosing her own name, of defining herself, rather than accepting the definitions others imposed, was both thrilling and terrifying. Ayana approached them, her arms full of clothing and ornaments that glittered in the firelight. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, and Nayeli translated with obvious delight. She says you must be prepared properly for the ceremony. You cannot be reborn as yourself while wearing the clothes of your old life. The old woman gestured toward Faith's everyday doeskin dress, which was beautiful but simple compared to the elaborate garments she carried. The preparation took hours, with multiple women participating in the intricate process of transforming Faith from a refugee into a bride of the people. Her hair was washed with yucca root until it shone like copper in the firelight, then braided with ribbons and feathers in patterns that told stories of survival and renewal. Her face was painted with symbols representing her journey from captivity to freedom, while her body was adorned with jewelry that had been worn by generations of Comanche women. The dress Ayana had prepared was unlike anything Faith had ever seen. Pure white doeskin so soft, it felt like water against her skin, decorated with thousands of tiny beads arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the dancing firelight. It was a garment worthy of a princess, but more than that, it was a symbol of the value these people placed on her presence among them. "You look like moonlight on water," Wakiza said quietly when she finally emerged from the women's lodge. He had been transformed as well, his hair freshly braided with eagle feathers, his face painted with the symbols of a warrior and hunter. But it was the expression in his eyes that took Faith's breath away, not desire or possession, but something deeper and more reverent, as if he were looking at something sacred. The ceremony itself was unlike anything from Faith's Christian upbringing, but it carried the same sense of solemn joy, of community coming together to witness and celebrate a significant transition. She was led to the center of the circle where Tahitan waited with a pipe carved from red stone and decorated with symbols of protection and blessing. "What name do you choose for yourself?" the war chief asked in careful English, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "What do you wish to be called in this new life you are building?" It was the question Faith had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The moment when she would have to decide not just what to call herself, but who she wanted to become. Faith looked around the circle of faces watching her with warmth and acceptance, these people who had taken her in when she was broken and helped her remember how to hope. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the courage it had taken to crawl through thorns and prairie grass rather than accept a life of cruelty. She thought about the strength Wakiza saw in her, the potential Ayana nurtured, the future that stretched ahead of her like an unmarked trail. "Itzia," she said finally, the Comanche word feeling strange but right on her tongue. "I choose to be called Itzia." Nayeli gasped with delight, and Faith saw Ayana nod approvingly. The name meant rainbow, something beautiful that appeared after storms, a bridge between the old world and the new. "Itzia," Tahitan repeated solemnly, and the name was taken up by voices around the circle until it seemed to echo from the very stars. "Welcome, Itzia, daughter of our people, sister to our women, protected by our warriors. May your new name bring you joy and strength in all the days to come." As the formal ceremony gave way to celebration, with drums and dancing and stories told around the fire, Faith, now Itzia, found herself pulled into the center of a community that had claimed her as their own. But even in the midst of the joy and acceptance, she found her eyes returning again and again to Wakiza, who watched her with an expression of quiet pride and something deeper that made her heart race. Later, when the celebration had wound down and most of the people had retired to their lodges, Wakiza approached her, where she sat beside the dying fire, still wearing the magnificent white dress, but with her hair now loose around her shoulders. He carried a small bundle wrapped in soft leather, which he placed carefully in her hands. "A gift," he said simply, "to celebrate your new name and your new life." Inside the leather wrapping was a necklace unlike anything she had ever seen, a delicate chain of silver holding a pendant carved from turquoise and shaped like a stylized rainbow. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master artisan. "Did you make this?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth stone and intricate metalwork. The pendant was warm from his touch, and she could see her new name etched in tiny symbols around the edge. "I began it the day after I found you," Wakiza admitted, his cheeks coloring slightly in the firelight. "I didn't know then what you would choose to call yourself, but I knew you would need something to mark your transformation. When you chose the name of the rainbow, I knew the design was meant to be." He gestured toward the pendant. "It represents the bridge between what was and what will be, the beauty that emerges from surviving the storm." As he fastened the necklace around her throat, his fingers brushing against her skin with careful reverence, Itzia felt the last pieces of her old identity fall away. She was no longer Faith Winters, the frightened girl who had accepted whatever treatment others chose to give her. She was no longer Faith Garrett, the brutalized wife who had been carved with lies about her own worth. She was Itzia, a woman who had chosen her own name and her own future, surrounded by people who saw strength where others had seen only weakness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotions she didn't have words for everything, for saving me, for protecting me, for helping me remember who I could be. She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. "And for being patient enough to let me choose you instead of just accepting that I belonged to you." Wakiza's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "The choice is always yours," he said softly. "Today, tomorrow, every day for the rest of our lives. I will never claim ownership of you, only the privilege of walking beside you for as long as you will have me." The promise was everything Edmund's vows had never been. A commitment to partnership rather than possession, to love as liberation rather than captivity. When he kissed her for the first time, it was with the same reverent gentleness he had shown her wounds, his lips barely brushing hers before pulling back to search her eyes for any sign of fear or reluctance. Finding only warmth and welcome, he kissed her again, deeper this time, but still careful, still asking permission with every touch. It was nothing like the brutal taking that had been Edmund's idea of marital affection. This was conversation, negotiation, mutual offering of something precious and freely given. "I'm not good enough to be your wife," she whispered against his lips, the old fears surfacing despite everything that had changed. "I'm damaged, marked, used. You deserve someone whole and pure and worthy of the honor you're offering." Even as she spoke the words, she could hear their falseness, could recognize Edmund's voice speaking through her mouth. Wakiza's response was to gently kiss each of the fading scars on her face, his lips warm and soft against the silver lines that marked her survival. "These scars tell the story of a woman who refused to be broken," he murmured against her skin. "They are not marks of shame, they are proof of courage. And courage, Itzia, is the most beautiful thing in all the world." As he continued his gentle worship of her scars, kissing each mark of violence as if it were sacred, Itzia felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be cherished, not despite her imperfections, but because of them, to be loved not for what she could provide, but for who she truly was. The sensation was overwhelming, transformative, and absolutely terrifying in the best possible way. "Will you have me?" Wakiza asked quietly, his forehead resting against hers as they shared the same breath in the firelight. "Will you be my wife, my partner, my equal in all things? Will you help me become the man worthy of the woman you are becoming?" The question was asked with such humility, such genuine uncertainty about her answer, that Itzia felt her heart break open with love. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of every choice she had made to survive, every moment of courage that had brought her to this point. "Yes, I will have you. I will be your wife and your partner and your equal. I will love you with all the strength I discovered in myself when I refused to accept that I was worthless." The words felt like a vow, a promise not just to him but to herself, under a sky brilliant with stars and surrounded by the quiet sounds of a camp at peace. Itzia, the woman who had once been Faith, claimed her future with both hands, choosing love over fear, partnership over submission, and hope over the bitter lessons of her past. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to grow into the person she was becoming. But tonight, wrapped in Wakiza's arms beside the dying fire, she was exactly where she belonged. 2 years had passed since Itzia had chosen her new name and her new life among the Comanche, and the woman who had once crawled through thorns to escape a brutal marriage had become something she never could have imagined. She sat now on a ridge overlooking the vast Texas plains, her infant daughter sleeping peacefully in a cradleboard against her back, while she watched Wakiza teaching their 6-year-old son how to track deer through the tall grass below. The scene filled her with a contentment so profound, it sometimes frightened her with its intensity. Little Ayan had been born during the harsh winter, when blizzards had trapped the band in a sheltered canyon for 3 months. The pregnancy had been difficult, bringing back memories of the violence her body had endured, but Ayana's skilled hands and patient wisdom had guided both mother and child safely through the ordeal. When Itzia had first held her son, looking into dark eyes that were unmistakably Wakiza's, she had wept with a joy so complete it felt like drowning in starlight. Now, watching father and son move together through the grass with the same fluid grace, she marveled at how completely her understanding of family had been transformed. Edmund had spoken of ownership, of wives and children as property to be controlled and shaped according to his will, but Wakiza treated their son as a small person worthy of respect, teaching him not through domination, but through patient example and gentle correction when needed. "Mama, look!" 5-year-old Tehia came running up the slope, her chubby legs pumping with determination as she clutched something precious in her small fists. She had inherited her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn chin, and possessed a fearless curiosity that sometimes made Itzia's heart stop with terror. "I found a baby bird that fell from its nest. Can we save it?" Her English was peppered with Comanche words, as was common among the children who grew up hearing both languages daily. Itzia examined the tiny creature carefully, noting its closed eyes and complete lack of feathers. "This baby is too young to survive away from its mother," she explained gently, remembering how Ayana had taught her to balance compassion with reality when dealing with wildlife. "But we can return it to its nest if we can find where it came from." She stood, adjusting baby Naira's cradleboard, and followed Tehia's pointing finger toward a cluster of cottonwood trees. As they searched for the nest, Itzia found herself thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 years ago, she had been a terrified bride begging for her life on her wedding night. Now she was a mother teaching her daughter about mercy and responsibility, surrounded by a family that had chosen to love her, not despite her scars, but because of the strength they represented. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here she was, living it. They found the nest tucked high in the fork of a cottonwood, and Itzia carefully climbed up to return the baby bird to its siblings, while Tehya watched with rapt attention from below. "Why did you do that?" the little girl asked as her mother climbed down. "Why didn't we just keep it and try to raise it ourselves?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "Because some things belong in certain places," Itzia explained, helping Tehya understand concepts that had taken her years to learn. "That baby bird belongs with its family, just like you belong with ours. We could have tried to raise it, but it would never have been truly happy or complete away from where it was meant to be." The words carried deeper meaning than a simple lesson about wildlife, and she could see Tehya processing the implications. Their peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and Itzia felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever strangers appeared near their camp. 2 years of safety had not entirely erased the reflexive fear that Edmund might somehow return, despite the fact that she knew he had died of infection from his bullet wound less than 6 months after their confrontation. Some scars on the spirit took longer to heal than those on the body, but these riders carried themselves with the easy confidence of friends, rather than the aggressive posture of enemies. As they drew closer, Itzia recognized Chaitan, now grown, into a respected warrior, accompanied by a woman she didn't know. The stranger was clearly white, with blonde hair and pale skin burned by the prairie sun, but she rode with the skill of someone who had spent considerable time among the Comanche. "Itzia," Chaitan called out as he dismounted, using the name that had become as natural to her as breathing. "I bring news from the northern bands, and a visitor who specifically asked to meet the white woman who chose to become Comanche." His tone carried a mixture of pride and curiosity that suggested this visit was significant in ways she didn't yet understand. The blonde woman dismounted with fluid grace, and Itzia could see immediately that she was no ordinary settler. Her clothes were a mixture of white and Comanche styles, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world after searching for it. When she spoke, her voice carried the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. "My name is Astrid Henriksen," the woman said, extending her hand in the white custom while offering the traditional Comanche greeting with her other hand. "I was captured by the Kiowa when I was 12 years old, and I have spent the last 15 years learning to be something that exists between two worlds." Her blue eyes met Itzia's directly, and there was a recognition there that spoke of shared experience. "I have heard your story," Astrid continued, "about how you escaped from a cruel husband and found safety among Wakiza's people, about how you chose to become Comanche rather than returning to a world that had failed to protect you. I wanted to meet you because I believed you might understand something that few others do, the courage it takes to choose a new identity when the old one has been destroyed." Itzia felt a shock of recognition at the woman's words. She had thought herself unique in her experience of crossing cultural boundaries through trauma and choice, but here was evidence that others had walked similar paths. "What brings you to seek me out?" she asked, genuinely curious about what had motivated this stranger to travel so far for a conversation. "I am working with the territorial government to establish a sanctuary for women who have been harmed by their husbands or families," Astrid explained, her voice carrying the passion of someone who had found her life's purpose. "A place where they can heal and learn new skills and decide for themselves what kind of future they want to build. But I need help from someone who understands both worlds, someone who can speak to women who have lost everything and help them see that survival is possible." The proposal hit Itzia like a physical blow, not painful, but overwhelming in its implications. For 2 years, she had focused on her own healing and the building of her new family, but she had never forgotten the terror and helplessness she had felt during those dark days with Edmund. The idea that she might be able to help other women find their way out of similar situations was both thrilling and terrifying. "You want me to leave my family?" she asked, her hand instinctively moving to touch baby Naira's sleeping form. The thought of being separated from her children, even for a good cause, made her chest tighten with anxiety. She had lost too much in her life to easily contemplate giving up what she had worked so hard to build. "Not permanently," Astrid said quickly, clearly understanding Itzia's concern. "The sanctuary is only 3 days' ride from here, and you would be able to return home frequently. But your story, your transformation, could give hope to women who believe they have no choices left. You could show them that it is possible to build a new life from the ashes of the old one." "Deal." Before Itzia could respond, Wakiza appeared at her side, having spotted the visitors and come to investigate. Their son Ayan followed close behind, his small face serious as he studied the strangers with the wariness his father had taught him. The family unit they formed was unconsciously protective, each member alert to potential threats while maintaining outward calm. "What is this about?" Wakiza asked in English, his tone neutral but carrying undertones that suggested he had heard enough to be concerned. The idea of his wife traveling to work with traumatized white women would naturally raise questions about safety and motivation. Astrid repeated her proposal, speaking directly to Wakiza as well as Itzia, clearly understanding that any decision would need to be made together. As she talked, Itzia watched her husband's face, noting the way his expression shifted from suspicion to thoughtfulness as he began to understand the scope of what was being suggested. "This is important work," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "Women who are trapped in violence need to know that escape is possible, that there are people who will help them build new lives." He paused, looking directly at Itzia. "But the decision is yours to make. I will support whatever choice you feel called to make." The response was so perfectly Wakiza, supportive without being controlling, offering his opinion while making it clear that the ultimate choice belonged to her. It was everything Edmund's authoritarian demands had never been, and the contrast still sometimes took her breath away. This was what partnership looked like when both people truly believed in equality. "I need time to think," Itzia said honestly, looking between Astrid and her family. "This is not a decision I can make quickly or lightly. There are many factors to consider, many people who would be affected by my choice." She could see disappointment flicker across Astrid's face, but also understanding and respect for the complexity of the situation. "Of course," Astrid agreed readily. "I can remain in the area for several days while you consider the proposal. Perhaps you would allow me to tell you more about the women we are trying to help, the conditions they are escaping from." There was hope in her voice, but also the patience of someone who understood that real change took time. That evening, as the family gathered around their fire for the evening meal, Itzia found herself studying each face in the flickering light. Tehya was chattering excitedly about the baby bird they had rescued, while Ayan listened with the serious attention of an older brother. Baby Naira nursed contentedly, making soft sounds of satisfaction that never failed to make Itzia smile. Wakiza sat beside her, his presence steady and warm, occasionally adding comments to the children's conversation. "Tell me what you are thinking," he said quietly, after the children had been settled for the night, and they sat alone beside the dying fire. "I can see the idea taking root in your mind, but I can also see your fear of what it might cost us." His ability to read her emotions had only grown stronger over the years, and she found his understanding both comforting and occasionally unnerving. "I keep thinking about the woman I was when you found me," Itzia said slowly, choosing her words carefully. How lost and broken I felt, how certain I was that I deserved everything that had been done to me. If someone like Astrid had been available then, someone who could have shown me that other choices existed, how much suffering might have been avoided? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. But you also found your way here without such help, Wakiza pointed out gently. Your own strength and courage brought you to safety. Perhaps the real question is whether you feel called to help others find that same strength in themselves. He was not trying to influence her decision, she realized, but rather helping her understand her own motivations. I do feel called to it, Itzia admitted, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. But I also feel terrified of leaving you and the children, even temporarily. What if something happens while I am gone? What if my absence harms our family in ways I cannot foresee? The fears were real and practical, rooted in her deep understanding of how quickly safety could be destroyed. Those are reasonable concerns, Wakiza acknowledged, his arm tightening around her shoulders in unconscious reassurance. But they are also fears that could prevent you from doing something important and meaningful. Perhaps the question is not whether risks exist, but whether the potential good outweighs those risks. They talked through the night, exploring every aspect of the decision from multiple angles. Wakiza shared his own thoughts about the importance of helping those who could not help themselves, while Itzia worked through her complex emotions about returning even partially to the white world she had left behind. By dawn, she had reached a conclusion that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I will do it, she told Astrid the next morning, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. But I have conditions. I will work for 3 months at a time, then return home for at least 1 month between assignments, and if my family needs me for any reason, I will come immediately, regardless of what work remains unfinished. Astrid's face lit up with joy and relief. Those conditions are more than reasonable, she said quickly. In fact, they show exactly the kind of wisdom and balance that will make you effective in this work. The women we help need to see that it is possible to choose service without sacrificing family, to find meaningful work without abandoning those we love. The farewell 3 days later was harder than Itzia had anticipated, despite knowing it was temporary. Tehia clung to her mother's leg, confused about why Mama had to go away to help strangers when her own family needed her too. Ayan maintained the stoic expression he had learned from watching his father, but his dark eyes were bright with unshed tears as he solemnly promised to take care of his sisters while she was gone. Remember, Wakiza whispered as he held her close one final time before she mounted her horse. You are not leaving us. You are extending the circle of our protection to include others who need it. The love you carry for this family will make you stronger in your work, not weaker. His words settled into her heart like a blessing, giving her the strength she needed to ride away from everything she held dear. The sanctuary Astrid had established was unlike anything Itzia had imagined. Built in a hidden valley accessible only through a narrow canyon, it consisted of several adobe buildings arranged around a central courtyard where women and children could gather safely. Gardens provided food and peaceful work, while workshops taught practical skills like sewing, weaving, and basic medicine. The entire place radiated an atmosphere of healing and hope that reminded Itzia powerfully of her first days in Ayana's lodge. The women who came seeking help carried stories that were heartbreakingly familiar, beatings disguised as discipline, isolation presented as protection, and the constant erosion of self-worth that came from being treated as property rather than people. But they also carried something else that Itzia recognized immediately, the spark of rebellion that had driven them to seek help, rather than accept their circumstances as inevitable. I don't know how to be anything but afraid, whispered Margaret, a young woman whose husband had broken her arm twice and told her it was her fault for being clumsy. Every time I think about leaving, I remember all the ways he said I would fail without him. How do you stop believing the terrible things people tell you about yourself? Itzia looked at Margaret's scared, hopeful face and saw her own reflection from 3 years ago. You start by surrounding yourself with people who tell you different stories about who you are, she said gently. And then you practice believing the kinder voices until they become louder than the cruel ones. It takes time and it takes courage, but it is possible. I know because I have done it. Over the following months, Itzia discovered that her own healing had prepared her for this work in ways she never could have anticipated. Every conversation with a frightened woman was also a conversation with her younger self, and each small victory in helping someone else find courage deepened her own understanding of the journey she had traveled. She was not just giving hope to others, she was receiving it in return. The work was difficult and sometimes heartbreaking. Not every woman who came to the sanctuary was ready to embrace the possibility of change, and some returned to their abusers despite all efforts to show them alternatives. But for every woman who went back, there was another who found the strength to build a new life, and those successes made all the challenges worthwhile. When she returned home after her first 3-month assignment, Itzia was surprised to find that she felt more complete rather than more divided. The experience of helping other women had not diminished her love for her family. It had enriched it, giving her a deeper appreciation for the safety and partnership she had found with Wakiza. She was a better mother, a better wife, and a better person because she had chosen to extend her compassion beyond the boundaries of her immediate circle. You look different, Wakiza observed as they sat together on their favorite ridge, watching their children play in the grass below while baby Naira slept peacefully between them. Not changed exactly, but more yourself than you have ever been. His words captured something she had been struggling to understand about her own transformation. I think I finally understand what Ayana meant when she said that healing is a gift that grows stronger when it is shared, Itzia replied, leaning against his shoulder with the comfortable ease of deep partnership. Every woman I help find her courage helps me find more of my own. Every story of survival I witness adds to my understanding of what is possible. Years passed, and Itzia's work with the sanctuary became a central part of her identity alongside her roles as wife and mother. Her children grew up understanding that their mother's calling extended beyond their immediate family, and they took pride in knowing that she was helping other people find safety and hope. Wakiza's support never wavered, and their marriage grew stronger rather than weaker as they learned to balance individual purpose with shared commitment. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Wakiza had found her crawling through the prairie. Grass! Itzia stood once again on the ridge overlooking the vast Texas plains. But now she was surrounded by an extended family that included not just her husband and children, but the dozens of women she had helped over the years, many of whom had become close friends and regular correspondents. The network of healing and support that had begun with one traumatized woman and one compassionate warrior had grown into something that touched lives across the entire territory. "Do you ever regret the choice you made?" asked Sarah, one of the first women Itzia had helped at the sanctuary, who had gone on to become a teacher and advocate in her own right. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had stayed in that marriage and accepted what seemed inevitable?" Itzia looked at her friend, then at her own family, then at the vast landscape that had witnessed so much transformation over the years. "I used to think that survival was just about staying alive," she said thoughtfully. "But I learned that true survival means becoming who you were always meant to be, despite the efforts of others to break or diminish you." She paused, touching the turquoise pendant that still hung around her neck, now worn smooth by years of wear. Every scar tells the story of a battle survived. Every choice to help others tells the story of strength shared. Regret? No. Gratitude. More than I could ever express. As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Itzia, the woman who had once been Faith, stood surrounded by the evidence of what was possible. When courage met compassion, when individual healing became collective transformation, the girl who had once whispered that she was not good enough to be anyone's wife had become a woman whose very existence proved that worth was not determined by others' opinions, but by one's own choices to survive, to grow, and to lift others. As she climbed, the scars on her back had faded over the years, becoming thin silver lines that caught the light like threads of precious metal woven into her skin. But more importantly, the lies they had once spelled out had been overwritten by a new story, one of courage, love, healing, and hope. And in the gentle evening breeze that carried the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers, she could almost hear Ayana's voice whispering the truth that had changed everything. Not worthless, precious, sacred, strong woman who survived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.